These are all 1,117,425 words across the entire Harry Potter series. And while big tech and language schools will tell you to learn a language by spending your money on yet another course or wasting your time in a gamified app, what if the best teacher was an 11-year-old boy with a scar, or a dragon rider, or whoever your favorite character is? It's all about flattening the curve of language learning. It's been a while since we've explored something like this on this channel, so let's do a simple recap. Let's say that you didn't know anything about English and decided, I'm gonna learn all my vocabulary from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. First of all, bold move. Here's how many new words you'd come across in each chapter, which starts high and then begins to go down before hitting a lower, non-zero steady state. This tall bar for chapter 1 includes words like Harry, could, magic, and something, and they're only counted here in chapter 1 when they're new, even though they could also show up in later chapters. In these bars for later chapters, you have less common words like ridgeback.
That's a Norwegian ridgeback.
And seas. The height of each bar could also be interpreted as the amount of effort to get through each page, since you'll need to look up more words as a complete beginner. And the Harry Potter nerds among you may notice this peak at chapter 5, with Harry's first exposure to the wizarding world via Diagon Alley, in a tour hosted by the often incomprehensible Hagrid.
And over there, all your bits and bobs for doing your wizardry.
But this overall shape is the curve that you want to focus on, and that's what we're trying to flatten. After reading the 80,000 total words of the first book in the series, your vocabulary could be up to 6,000 words richer, since that's how many unique words there are if you don't count repeats. And with around 90% overlap with the 500 most common English words, Harry Potter is decently representative of the English language. For the record, I took a similar approach when learning German, where I made note cards for every single new word that I came across. Not that I recommend that, though more on that in a minute. That means to grow your vocabulary via reading, you will have an initial steep hill to climb, but it does get easier. For Harry Potter, that hill is around 5 chapters in, or a little less than a third of the way through the book, though there's a similar pattern for other books. But just knowing that it will get easier does not make the initial hill any easier to climb, which is why people will spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars paying for a course, or they'll just download an app like Duolingo to get started. But since both of these can suck the life and the vibrance out of any language you may want to learn, my question is, how much do you need to know before you can start reading and watching TV with some degree of confidence and comfort? Or if we call back to one of the cultural seminal moments for data visualization and think of the COVID-19 pandemic, how do we flatten the curve? This time, just for language learning. For those who don't remember this visualization, and without getting political, the challenge with any pandemic is that if there are more sick people than hospital beds and medical staff available to treat the patients, people can die of a treatable sickness only because there are too many sick people at once. But if the spread of the pandemic is controlled to a more reasonable pace, you can have more people survive, even if the total number of people who get sick is the same. And that's only because you flatten the curve so the hospital system can better handle things. Now back to language learning. If you try to learn too much at once, your language learning journey may die. And depending on who you are, if you have to look up more than 1,000 words to get through one chapter of a teen fantasy novel, you may want to die. But as I and many other language learners can attest to, if you get the pacing right, you can learn a lot, you can enjoy yourself, and you can build motivation to continue, all thanks to reading. So there are 3 paths based on research and experience that I want to suggest for how to flatten the curve. By laying a foundation, by changing how you read, and by adjusting your pacing. And to prime you before we get into this with the final conclusion, try out reading a book in your target language a bit before you feel ready, because I think you'll be surprised by how capable you are and how compelling this method can be. The first way to flatten the curve is by laying a foundation before you start on this hill. How many words do you need to know so that that initial hill becomes more manageable? Or said another way, do you really need to take a course or do 6 months of Duolingo before you read your first book? Well, our baseline is that chart we already looked at. You know nothing before you start reading. And now let's try flattening the curve. If you wait and only start reading Harry Potter after learning 500 words by taking a beginner course or completing one meaningful chunk of Duolingo, here's what your curve would look like. It's interesting that the first chapter would be a bit easier to get through, but there's no real advantage after that because the curves look the same. Now let's do the same thing if you had finished 2 courses or all of Duolingo with 1,000 words, and now 2,000 words. And what about if you knew 5,000 words? These levels roughly correspond to the language proficiency scale used in the EU and much of the world. Okay, so most of the gains are had in the first couple of chapters in the book. And it looks like you need somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 words in your vocabulary to mostly flatten the curve. But think about how long you'd have to spend in courses to truly flatten this curve. To hit that 5,000 word vocabulary in the Common European Framework is roughly a level of B2, which is estimated to be around 700 hours in the classroom. That's an hour a day for 2 years before you can read a book. And after all that effort, you're still going to come across more than 3,500 words you've never seen before. Admittedly, the more you learn, the better you get at using context to figure out what words mean, so perhaps the curves would be a little bit flatter than this chart lets on. But this first approach highlights that there are some seriously diminishing returns for the idea of studying first and only enjoying yourself at some point in the future. In my mind, that's one vote for getting started sooner. Hapax Legommenon. Well, that sounds like a pretty good hex. A Hapax Legommenon is a word that shows up only one time in a text. And that original curve shows exactly that, the total number of words that you could learn, even if that's not recommended. As a language learner, you probably don't need to know words like minuscule and knickerbocker that only show up once in the first book of this series. Let's assume that you want to be a bit more selective and you only want to look up or learn words that come up a certain number of times. We'll try a couple of different options to see how the curve flattens when we only count words that show up 2 times, 5 times, 10 times, and 20 times across the entire first book of Harry Potter. To me, the most compelling option is the curve for words that show up at least 5 times. Since only 28% of the individual words in Harry Potter show up 5 or more times, you have a much more palatable amount to learn. And yes, there are some peaks and valleys in this updated curve, but the overall trend line is flatter than before. It's all about trade-offs here. We want to flatten the curve so that the pacing is right, but we don't want to lower the curve too much so that you're not learning anything. Reading your first book in another language is primarily about getting comfortable, and it's not about learning every single word that you come across. The underlying point here is that for certain immersion activities, get comfortable not knowing everything and focus on what you are learning and focus on what is worth learning. In theory, you could take your time and learn every single new thing that you come across, and it might be tempting to look up every word or every new conjugation as you go. You can do that for some of your immersion, some of the time, but not if it's deflating to do so and if it's a huge interruption every time. Think about when you listen to a podcast or an audiobook or watch something even in your own native language. Things sometimes rush by without you understanding or paying attention, and that's okay. Get what you want out of it, and hopefully you're understanding and learning something along the way, and then move on. To make this practical, because I assume that you don't have code written to identify what words have come up at least 5 times in whatever you're reading or whatever you're immersing in, use your intuition based on your current level to see what you should be learning. And another tip is many online dictionaries give you a basic sense of how common a word is, like the bars in the online version of the Duden, the German dictionary, shown here. As you begin, focus on words with 4 or 5 bars here, since they'll be most useful to you. And perhaps the simplest and most intuitive way of flattening the curve is balancing the amount of new content and material that you're going through versus the time you spend reinforcing what you already know. The original chart that we started with focuses on the number of new words in each chapter of Harry Potter, but you could flatten this curve by focusing on the number of pages, not the number of chapters. The almost 1,200 words that you learn in the first chapter of Harry Potter are spread out over just 16 pages. But by the end of the book, in chapter 17, you're only learning about 200 new words in 22 pages, which is 8 times less than that first chapter. So when you're reading your first book in a new language after laying the foundation, maybe you just focus on 1 paragraph or even 1 sentence a day and do that for a week, and then once you're ready to move on, you can increase. If you're willing to celebrate reading even a single sentence in another language as if you had finished a marathon, if you stick with your studies and your immersion, I guarantee you that eventually you will be able to finish actual marathons in your target language in the form of book series and in watching TV shows and in connections with new friends. I started reading this book after 2 months of learning German, and my foundation was only a few hundred words. It took me forever to read a page when I first started out, but I slowly started increasing from first a paragraph a day, then a page a day, and my vocabulary started to grow when I got all of those words into Anki and studied those. And this book unlocked German for me, plain and simple. And the same thing happened with Hebrew. It's like, do you think that you get this level of grime on a dictionary without doing thousands of lookups across thousands of pages? And all of this started by just focusing on what I wanted to read. I'm 2 months and 528 new vocab words into my 1-year Arabic challenge, and I'm hoping to start Harry Potter in the next month or so. That's probably too soon, and it'll be painfully slow to start. But you can't let all of the things you don't know get in the way of what you're trying to do. Or, said another way, you're never going to be ready. So why not get started now? I've included links to Harry Potter in about a dozen languages for Kindle in the description down below. Those are affiliate links if you want to support the channel to enable more videos like this. Only you can decide when you feel like the language learning curve is flat enough for you to get started on a challenge like this and try and read your first book in another language. But like I said before, I think you should try it sooner than you think. I think you'll be surprised by how compelling and enjoyable it can be and how capable you are. Thanks again for watching. I've got another Arabic monthly update video coming next week, and I'll catch you in the next one.